Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Clark with the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy here at UConn. Thank you so much for joining us here today. When I say us, there's actually other people in the room here at UConn Hartford. So you can see them, and they'll be participating in the conversation as well as the folks. Hi, Jacob. The folks virtually as well. So this is the last of our Lunch and Learn series, and I want to thank Irvine Pexagaya with the Institute for setting this up for us. This is our, first foray in the Hartford Times building at UConn here of just being able to reach out to the broader community and give a sense of the work that we do, hopefully for some educational purposes, but also to draw interest in potential collaboration and partnerships. So very interested to have that conversation at the end of the discussion today. So today I'm going to focus on the International Justice Exchange. It's a fairly new initiative here at the Institute, although it's been bubbling for quite some time. It actually started with our work in prisoner reentry, which was essentially our seminal work in the start of the Institute in the early 2000s, coming from our work at the legislature, where Connecticut was facing an exponentially growing prison population and the corresponding costs, not just to taxpayers, but also to society and humanity. And so a lot of the work that has been done over the years to focus on reentry, to focus on international best practices has been done across the U.S. And we were a part of that, but we've been learning about other systems outside of the U.S. That could share information with us and we can learn from, and so that's what this is about. So I'm going to start the slideshow here. So I want to first start with a quote by our own Mark Twain. Travel is fatal to prejudice. Oh, I love that sound. These sounds come with our computers here. I don't know how to turn them off, but it's guided by belief, the exchange, that direct exposure to alternate systems is paramount to gaining perspective. It's giving ground level stakeholders firsthand experiences with international justice systems and documenting these experiences to share with people that don't go on these trips. The long-term possibilities include the development of model laws, policies, and regulations to be implemented within Connecticut that will greatly assist our state's reform efforts for years to come. And our first experiences have been with Norway and Germany. And what I'll say is this morning I came from Carl Robinson Correctional Institution here in Connecticut. There was, as part of this work, I've been really connected with Representative Robin Porter, and one of her interns this year is Destiny Smith out of Quinnipiac University. And she invited me up to the final celebration of the Inside Out prison exchange class offered through Quinnipiac University. And essentially it's 14 students and 14 individuals incarcerated, and they offer in various facilities, but this was at Carl Robinson up in Enfield. And they have throughout the semester a class together. And they explored a variety of topics. But today was just a celebration of that class. And this Inside Out program is the same concept of the International Justice Exchange. It's perspective building. And what I heard from the students there, both those that are incarcerated and those that aren't, was that it was a life-altering experience. Beliefs that they had when they brought to the class were shattered, essentially. They came to view each other much more as humans with like, travails, with like concerns, with like thoughts, much more so than what divided them. And it was really touching to see. And I think in my experience, when that happens, these moments occur. And so it's really about taking us out of our comfort zones and saying, what can we learn through the process of education, expanding our horizons, and saying, what are other people doing around the state, around the country, that we can learn from, that maybe we don't traditionally think is an area that we could be learning from. So again, that's the basic principle behind that. So a little bit of a background. Now, over the past 2 decades, Connecticut has taken several steps to reform its prison and overall systems. As I mentioned, we had an exponentially growing prison system. When I first started working in the early 2000s, we maxed out at 2008. I say maxed out, but that can always occur again, with 20,000 prisoners. And if you think about it, that was an amazing trajectory that started in the 70s, because prior to that, for the previous 50 years, we only had 3,000 individuals that were incarcerated. And our population, our general population, hasn't really changed that much. So as I talked before, that exponential growth had a huge impact on the rest of the state, on, we're here in higher education, on how much UConn students pay for your education, or how much debt you incur after that. A lot of that is because we made a decision in the state that we were going to fund justice. And by funding that, we then took an element of the budget that was traditionally reserved for other programs, and we put it into a sector for a belief that we were creating public safety. And as we learned over the years, public safety really wasn't tremendously impacted by that, but we certainly know the other impacts of that. And so Connecticut has been in this reform movement, much like the rest of the country, for a number of years now. And as I mentioned, a lot of that work had been going across the states and saying, oh, what's happening here? What's going on in Maine, so folks are allowed to vote in Maine. What does that mean? But the fact of the matter is, the bar is relatively low in the United States, and that's something that we've learned also from this international justice exchange. We're the world's largest jailers. We have a 25th of the world's population, and yet a quarter of its prison population. So going across our country and saying, how can we do things better, really limits our perspectives. And so in 2015, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, our former governor, our former correction commissioner, and our former undersecretary for criminal justice policy and planning in the administration went to Germany to visit a few of their prisons. They came back and they were transformed. Essentially, when asked, the governor was asked, what would you like to do when you come back? And he said, everything. I'd like to do everything. The fact of the matter is, everything did not occur. And they did change around a few units within 2 prisons now in Connecticut, and those have gotten a lot of high-profile media attention and the like, or at least they had before COVID. And there really hadn't been much talk about them of late. COVID had a real impact on our understanding of the prison system, because everything was essentially locked down. And we had a new administration that really wasn't focused and hasn't been focused on justice reform. And that's nothing new in Connecticut. Malloy was really an anomaly in terms of him wanting to leave a legacy of justice reform. And so the question is, can we generate some more interest in this work? And that's what the International Justice Exchange is attempting to do. So when I talked about the 2015 trip, well, before that, in 2014, at the Institute's annual Building Bridges Conference, and this is when we were at Central Connecticut State, we first learned of Vera's European American Prison Project. And that work began because the prison law office out of California had won a suit on prison overcrowding in California. And with the proceeds from that, they wanted to do something different. That director said he was inspired by the innovative and humane approaches to sentencing, treatment, and prison reform in other countries, and he wanted to bring that to the US. So we were hearing from, and you can see a video here, and I have links and whatnot, and I'll be able to share this afterwards, but this is a video that you can watch of this is Sarah from Vera talking about that European American Prison Project. And that was the first really highly profile documented exchange of 4 states, and it was correction commissioners, some judges, a very limited group of people that went over to the Netherlands and Germany. And when we were hearing from them, I would say across the crowd, and we typically had about 300 to 400 people in a conference like this, they were fascinated, to say the least. And, so it really generated an interest, and having conversations with Vera, it turns out that they were thinking about doing this more, and they were able to, in that next round, afford the opportunity to our governor, our former correction commissioner, and Undersecretary Lawler. And so I mentioned a little bit about this. By the way, we did talk to former Commissioner Semple the other day. He still is doing a tremendous amount of this work, even though he's retired from Connecticut. He continues in other states doing this. But Connecticut Mirror article in 2016, the governor's main takeaway was they actually want to reform people, he said. We concentrate on retribution here as opposed to reform. And I think arguably that is our main goal in the justice system, is retribution. Everything else is secondary or tertiary. And so following that experience, there's a set of initiatives that was launched within the Connecticut Department of Correction. That link there is to the Connecticut DOC page, where you can find out more about those initiatives. As I mentioned, it was fairly unique for, sometimes I feel like just a state historian a little bit, but just reminding people, because, COVID has also had an impact on this, on the things that we have been doing over the past 20 years. We had a governor that had a conference not too far from here, actually at the convention center, and his first lady, who was really also very much engaged in this work, called Reimagining Justice. This was in 2017, and it highlighted many of the changes to the approach to youth justice in particular, because that's what they focused on when they came back from Germany. And I show here a panel that happened. It was a multi-day event. Hundreds of people attended. And this was some of our staff here at the Institute participated in it. And this was the incarceration panel at 1:45 on Wednesday, June 14th. And you can see some of the folks that were on that, including the governor and Fred Patrick, who was a dear friend from Vera, unfortunately passed away, but was really, pushing this effort over at Vera, and Trevor Johnson, who we are good friends with over in Adult Probation and Court Support Services Division. So that was an event that they had, again, wanting to bring this information to educate the larger Connecticut stakeholder group, the larger public, about this work. So we heard again about their trip and the things that were happening since then. When the Institute along this time was also educating in another area. This was, we had partnered with PBS Frontline and the New York Times to help produce a documentary called Life on Parole. And for over a year, and I know we have Jake Werblow, who's on the call with us, helped to organize panel discussions of this documentary across the state, essentially affording folks in Connecticut who may not understand the challenges of the justice system and those that are within it, what reentry means on parole. And I think it was a good way. And we did this we also provided information on other systems so people could compare that challenge of reentry. And one of the things that I'd say about reentry that I've learned from these experiences so far with the international program is they prepare for reentry right from the beginning of incarceration. And it's really a step down process so that when you are released, you are ready, as prepared as you can be to reintegrate into society. And in Connecticut, in the US in general, that process is not as defined. And there's just a lot of pressure on that period from going from incarceration to the community. It's like, instead of a step down, in a lot of ways, it's like going off of a cliff. And so there's just so many things that an individual is challenged with when they're being released, again, in Connecticut, in the US, that you won't necessarily see in these international systems, because they're preparing, their primary motivation is preparing people for that point. And it's important to note here as a set aside, which most people don't understand, is well over 95% of the people that are incarcerated in Connecticut, this is across the country, return. They return to communities. So one of the big questions is, or should be a primary concern, is how are they returning? Are they ready to return? And so, we were focusing on this with the Life on Parole series. At this time, and this wasn't new to the US, the conversation about our experience with racism, our experience with slavery, our continued experiences of racism. A book came out from Michelle Alexander, which interestingly enough, they read at the Inside Out prison exchange class as well. And it was called The New Jim Crow. And it talked about how the justice system essentially took over the Jim Crow laws, which essentially were put in place as a replacement of slavery, to essentially continue to marginalize the Black in particular, but brown populations in our country. And so we had a conversation. We invited Michelle Alexander. This was really spectacular evening that she came. I think there was over 2,000 people in attendance. This was again at Central Connecticut's Welty Hall. And the next day we had the Building Bridges Reframed conversation. And during that conversation, we talked about reentry, a pathway to success. And we explored some of the changes within the Department of Corrections since that trip to Germany. And we got a little bit more of a closer look at the True Unit, what was happening there, and what the plans were for the future. And so from there, in 2018, the IMRP and the Connecticut Reentry Collaborative produced the state's first wide reentry strategy since 2011. And here's where I'll back up and say the report tied together the justice reform since the early 2000s, starting with the Justice Reinvestment Initiative and culminating with the outgoing Governor's Second Chance Initiative. And the reentry strategy was something that was put into state law. So it's a statutorily required strategy that was, again, a part of the system of reforms that wanted to make sure that we were systematically addressing safety in a way that was outcome driven, that was evidence driven, and that kept track of those outcomes and was holding ourselves accountable, and was also putting out strategies, planning documents to reflect our current understanding of best practices. So that's what that report attempted to do. That's on the Reentry Collaborative site. And in the introduction, it also offered that another shift worth consideration is highlighted by the recent exchanges with Germany in particular, and they have significantly lower incarceration recidivism rates than any other American jurisdiction. And they're primarily due to focusing the work in prison to that of normalization and reintegration, as I talked about before. hence successful reentry. The main driver of these outcomes is a philosophy of the justice system that sees the taking away of freedom as punishment, while the focus of life in prison is that of rehabilitation and reintegration. And I think that's really important because, as I mentioned, as Governor Malloy mentioned, we're a retributive system. Punishment, the idea of punishment is lifelong once you've entered the justice system in Connecticut and across the US. So having a prison system, having an overall justice system that says, yes, you did something, as Per Vaj, who's on the call as well, likes to say, now we have to put society in balance. And how do we do that? And the role of the prison system is doing that for the benefit of the victims, for the benefit of society in general. And you don't do that by punishing people through retribution. You do that by offering them a different way, by offering them things that can actually make sure that they're held accountable for those actions in ways that we don't do that. It means that it takes work to get to a place where you're better off than when you came in, and you can come out ready and prepared to reintegrate. So that reentry strategy noted that, and it's important to notice and to note that's also still a statutorily required strategy. It's part of the Undersecretary's role in Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Division here in Connecticut. And again, part of this larger infrastructure like the State Sentencing Commission, the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, and others that are meant to put some standards and hold the system accountable and make sure that it's constantly informed by best practices. So in 2019, we had another building bridges. You're seeing a theme here. We've had multiple building bridges over the years, hopefully another one to come soon. This one, we talked about decarceration. And essentially what was important here was noting that Connecticut had one of the 5 highest rates of decarceration in the country. And so this is not decarceration for the sake of decarceration alone. This is, again, with the backdrop of how are we creating safer society? So we were constantly mindful of public safety. We are constantly mindful of the impact of incarceration. And so we wanted to make sure as this decarceration trend occurred, that it was doing so in the best interests of the state, and it did. Undersecretary Lawler, when he was in that position, really highlighted time and again to the press and anyone who would listen that we were not only in rates of imprisonment that we hadn't seen in well over 2 decades, but we were also in rates of public safety that we hadn't seen since the 1960s. So this did not negatively impact public safety. It actually positively impacted public safety. And certainly if you go into any communities that are hit most hard by the prison system, you can understand why having 1 in 4 African-American individuals or men between the ages of 20 and 30 experiencing incarceration does not do the community, it doesn't do a family, it doesn't do that individual any benefit towards public safety. And so we highlighted that decarceration, and more and more individuals along this time across the country were beginning to understand, in particular Western Europe, and I want to mention that it's not limited to that, but Germany and Norway, the idea of a humane, restorative, and effective justice system. So the question was, what is the next step here? We're decarcerating, we are we're impacting public safety, but can we do better? Because I talked about reentry, we still are having recidivism rates. So this is return to prison rates of roughly 50%, rearrest rates of 70% after 3 years. I think we can all agree that we can do better than that. That any other system, any other thing that we like to invest resources in should have a better return on that investment than a 70% or a 50% failure rate. So as this work continued, we again looking at best practices, how can we do it better? And these countries in particular were being highlighted as learning places of learning for us. And so during this time, we had a Master's of Social Work intern from, I believe she was from Fairfield University, Kelly Ladd. And this was again when we were at Central. She introduced the Institute to Ellen Shee, who was assistant prison governor in the prison in Mjøsen, Norway. She's now the prison governor there. Again, the prison governor is equivalent to a warden here. She just happened to, the reason why I'm highlighting this is because to show that little ideas are sparks, and don't ever be afraid of little ideas. You know, they can lead to something. And she essentially knew what we were doing, and she just happened to have her boyfriend was from Norway, and she spoke with someone who knew a security guard at a prison near his house, and that security guard spoke with his supervisor. Her name was Ellen, and she worked at the prison, and she's aware we may want to reach out to her via phone to ask her some philosophical questions. She was probably wondering what's this about, but she was very willing to do that. This was in February 2020, if anybody recalls around that time period. What happened next? Well, we were supposed to have it on the 18th of February. Someone got sick, it was postponed, and then all of a sudden we were not in a position to be calling or talking to anybody. We were dealing with COVID-19. We did subsequently reach out to her, and this was through actually one of the, there's a lot of downfalls, I would say personally, about living in a virtual world, but Zoom afforded us a tremendous opportunity to have human contact, not just by calling or email, but actually seeing them and conversing. And we had a series of conversations, and we brought Ms. Shee into those conversations, looking at the experience in the Norwegian system with COVID versus the Connecticut system here. We were doing comparisons. It was just fascinating for everybody to see that they didn't necessarily have to completely shut down, that they weren't as concerned about the health and well-being because individuals there had their own rooms. They had their own showers in their rooms. They had their own TVs that they could get program content and the like. They were essentially in self-contained units. So as much as that sometimes isn't great in a long period of time, they were able to essentially mitigate that crisis a lot differently than we are here, where there's a lot of dorms, there's a lot more individuals incarcerated in particular facilities. They have more facilities, but they're smaller. We have fewer facilities, but they're larger. So we found out about these things, and they were really fascinating. And then in 2021, in March, we partnered with Jim Cavallera from the University Network for Human Rights and released Connecticut at the Crossroads. And we essentially, in this report outlined in talking about the pandemic, we said there's an opportunity here. With every crisis, there's an opportunity, and we have a real opportunity here to shift, to look at decarceration and ask ourselves, what are the next steps? What are we going for? What are we leading to here? What do we really want out of our justice system? And so we made a series of recommendations on that. And a lot of those were bound in this concept of human rights, which was new to some of us in this work, and also focused on the Norwegian and German systems. So that's just a copy of the report there. And there's some of these recommendations. I'm noticing the time, so I'll go through these a little bit more quickly. But essentially talked about this justice reinvestment concept that we started this work at, and that's the idea that if you can take savings from decarceration and invest that into the communities that are most impacted by it, you can stop that cycle of recidivism. You can create more healthy communities, and you could do all that for the benefit of the greater society and public safety. And so we recommended a renewed justice reinvestment initiative, and then also focusing on the reforms from the previous administration and talking about how they could be continued. So So, as I mentioned, this was essentially our first foray for a lot of us into this UN human rights standards and this understanding of what standards are there in the US, what standards are there in other countries for human rights, and how does that impact how these other countries operate versus Connecticut and the US. And so I think just here, it's important to note that in 1955, the UN issued the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. And it says essentially that they universally acknowledge minimum standards for the detention of prisoners. And you can go on there, you could see what's really important to note is that, and this pair can maybe talk about a little bit later, is we brought this up to Norway because they had a system that was very retributive. They had a system that was very punishment oriented in the 90s, but the European Commission with those standards came in and said, you're not adhering to the minimum standards for the treatment of youth. You need to do something about it. And they took it seriously because they actually ratified it. And they see that those standards superseding their law. So that's really one of the key differences that we've come to realize between the US, who thinks we are so exceptional, we don't have to be held by standards like this, versus a body that we frankly helped to set up that rests in New York City that we don't even adhere to. That's good for everybody, but not for us. And these are things that we've learned in these conversations. And 60 years later, in 2015, the UN updated their guidelines known as the Mandela Rules. Nelson Mandela from South Africa, well-known first Black leader after apartheid in South Africa. And they include 122 detailed rules for the treatment of prisoners. And the first article and the guiding principle of the Mandela Rules requires that all prisoners shall be treated with the respect due to their inherent dignity and value as human beings. And I would wonder if we think the same here in Connecticut. I would wonder if we think the same in our standards, which they've actually codified in law in the German Prison Act in Norway as their guiding principle as well. So, I go into a little bit more of the human rights standards in terms of being able to circulate freely, being restricted only when necessary. And there shouldn't be, everything should be designed to rehabilitate those in conflict with the law and facilitate their reintegration into society. They must be the primary goals of any rights-respecting criminal justice system. And they also say that the use of prison should be strictly limited to being a measure of last resort. Prisons represent a waste of scarce resources and human potential. And it's important that you have a body that acknowledges that, a waste of scarce resources and human potential. And that's not denigrating anybody that is working for the system or, has been a part of that system here. It's, it becomes and has become a necessary part of our society. But we also should understand that if we could lessen that impact in society over time, we could use those resources on things that are positive in a lot of ways for our society. So if we can avoid people going to prison in the first place, still have justice, still have safe societies, then we could use those resources for other things. And then one of the principles also requires that those directly affected by state policies be fully involved in the decision-making process, something that doesn't really happen here in the US and Connecticut as well. Things are being done to you, not necessarily with you in that process. And we found this in going to Norway as well, is, the rights of individuals. They know there's publications within prisons telling people their rights and how they can get involved if they think that they're being undermined. And so after that report, after we began to learn this, essentially we launched the International Justice Exchange. Not too much fanfare, by the way. It's just we decided it's important to encapsulate this, and so in the spring of 2022, we started getting more and more that a relationship that we built with Ellen. We also had some student workers with us that reached out. I want to note Brittany Lamar here, who made the cold call, again, another cold call to Pervaj, who's on the call with us today. And we reached out, and we also talked to a professor from the University of Oslo, and we had a series of webinars about those systems, and in Norway in particular, and learning from them. And I was also through the Human Rights Research Consortium here at UConn, which is an agreement between Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, and the state of Baden-Württemberg in Germany. It's again squarely focused on human rights, but these our state and Baden-Württemberg have invested resources to ensure that this consortium exists, that it can work on these human rights research areas. And through that work, I was able to go to Tübingen, Germany, where I met with Professor Dr. Rudiger Wolf, who was the former director of the Criminology Institute at the University of Tübingen, and so started to make those connections for a subsequent trip to Germany as well, and some more conversations there. So this is just the first webinar that we had, learning from Norway. Again, we heard from the professor Thomas Uglevik from the Department of Criminology and Sociology Law at the University of Oslo. One of his postdocs, James Jetter, who's from Connecticut here and a co-founder of the Full Citizens Coalition, also works with the Yale Prison Education Initiative, and Barbara Fair, who went on the Norway trip with us, and Mike Waller, that former undersecretary, now primarily an associate professor at University of New Haven, as well as, and I moderated, and Dr. Daniel Cooper. One of the things this is, and you can, we have these on our website, so you can watch them. Professor Uglevik, we were talking, so James, the Full Citizens Coalition is talking about voting rights, essentially. In Connecticut, not too long ago, nobody that was serving a sentence outside of prison or inside could vote. That could be on probation, parole, the like. Probation, that was changed. Folks on probation could vote, but it was through the efforts of James and others, the Sentencing Commission here, that a recent change in the law is allowing folks that are on parole to vote. But when we talked to Thomas Uglevik, the professor in the University of Oslo, he said the idea of removing the right to vote for the incarcerated, this is anybody who's done anything but is incarcerated, has never been discussed in modern day at all. And it's seen across the political spectrum as total science fiction. It's not something we would even consider. And I think that's important because, again, I'm talking about, like, travel is fatal to prejudice. We just become so used to what the systems that we've had here that we think that they're normal. But I'll tell you, in these exchanges that we've had, there's a real question from folks outside of the U.S. The U.S. is still looked at as a paramount of democracy, of community, of science, of law, of a lot of things. All these smaller countries in particular, but others, they look to the U.S. as a standard bearer, but they look at our justice system and they say, what is going on there? What are you doing? It seems like you're progressing in this way, but in these ways, you're going back to the dark ages. And so I think it's important that we consider those perspectives and why people would have them. And just the fact that it's anathema for Norway to think of, or other countries to think of taking away the right to vote as something that's beneficial to society. And then the next one we had, these were in May and June of 2022. We were learning directly from correctional staff in Norway, and a former warden here, who also went on the trip to Norway with us, Bob Gillis. It was moderated by Kellen Lyons. Unfortunately, Kellen's no longer with the Connecticut Mirror, but if you've ever had a chance to read any of his work, he did a tremendous job here in Connecticut covering the justice system. And, you know, these are some of the takeaways that we had from those conversations. And this is Ellen and James and Sander. James and Sander worked in the youth unit in Norway. They have 2 years of training and includes 1 year in school with subjects like psychology, ethics, and much about the law. We're learning about why people do what they do and how young people's minds are working, so you can meet young inmates with the knowledge of how they are reacting to being in prison. We have 12 weeks of training here in Connecticut before someone becomes a correctional officer. They don't get this type of background. And so this is another thing that in conversations with Per, like this idea of competency. If you're not completely competent in understanding of this, working in a prison is not an easy thing. It's where society sends individuals that have the most complex and challenging needs. And if you're not ensuring that the people working in there are competent to be able to address those needs, then it's gonna be a flight or fight type of environment. And that's just what we have in our prisons for the most part. I mean, I am creating these standards obviously vary a little bit, but essentially there is a big difference between 12 weeks of training and 2 years with a possible third year of actually getting a bachelor's degree in correctional service. And through that also engenders individuals that are interested in that way of life. So people working there, this is Sanders saying, I just want to work to get these guys out again, to help them, to make sure one mistake is not the sentence of their life. And this is what we were hearing across the system. And this is one of the things too, that I think was fascinating to us, was hearing about what they were telling us about what happened in their system, and then actually witnessing it and seeing it was not much different. The reality met the rhetoric, and that was important. And here is an individual, and this was on balance. You'll see it in the documentary I mentioned later, that the folks going into this system are interested in changing lives. They're often teachers, they're often working in other lines of service work for society, and they end up going and deciding that they want to be a CEO. A little aside here, which we also learned, they also are, because it's not that environment that is adversarial, and there's very little inmate on inmate violence, or very little inmate on staff violence, and it's not as caustic an environment, and so it's not considered hazardous duty to work in a correctional system there, and so they work till 62 years old. And here we can retire at 40 and get full retirement after 20 years. I think it changed recently, maybe 25, but so that's a big difference as well. And so our third webinar, we looked at the rights of the child. We heard from Per, who was the former director of the Western region in the Norwegian Correctional Service, and Per Amdahl, his former assistant prison governor, in particular of the Bjorgen Prison Youth Unit West. What's important to note there is they consider youth, they don't arrest any juvenile, any youth until the age of 15. We recently upped the age from 7 to 10 here in Connecticut. So I don't know if any of you guys are parents or have siblings that are 7 or 10 years old. The concept of like holding them accountable the same as you would a 25, 26-year-old, again, this is another thing that when you look at it from the outside in these other countries, they're wondering what we're doing. And not only that, so their youth, I think, is 15 to 18 years old, and they have only 8 actual spots for youth in the entire country. And now this is 5.6 million people. We're about 3.5 million here. They have 8 spots to incarcerate those 15 to 18 years old. We have far more than that here in Connecticut alone. And those youth go as young. I don't know if we have any 10-year-olds incarcerated, but at least 14, possibly 13. And then even up to age 21 is considered youth here in some of our facilities. So the final remarks from Per, and this is important to note too. So hearing that perspective, why these systems think the way they do, is exclusion of people from a society brutalizes, while inclusion will make people participate, and participation is calming human beings and opponents, and also feeling a membership in a public society. When we punish, when we marginalize, we don't make people feel like they're one of us or a part of society. We're actually telling them, you're not a part of society. We don't want you to be a part of society. And yet, at the same time, we're saying, don't do anything against society when you come back, because we'll get you again. It's just really, when you think about these things and you've had the opportunity, it's just ridiculous in a lot of ways, our logic and how we run things. And as he said, serving a sentence is also a responsibility for the government, because we incarcerated people, we take care of them, we take power over their time, but we don't need, in doing that, to stop giving them education. We don't need to give them bad food or old rooms or short beds. That's the way you have to think in a modern society. When we know these things, we can maybe say in other societies they didn't know these things. Maybe they just, it came out of, from a lack of understanding. But now that we know these things, why aren't we implementing them? And that's a question that we have to reflect on here in Connecticut. That's a question we have to reflect on in the United States in general. So all right, I'm going to breeze through here because I realize it's only 12 minutes left. And so long story short, we're able to go to Norway. We were able to kick the tires. There was 13 of us. We also brought along folks from Connecticut Public, that's CPTV, that documented that. And we were able to take a look at a number of facilities in Bergen, in Mjøsen, which is near Oslo. And Per was our host in Bergen, and Ellen was our host in Oslo. And it was just awesome meeting them in person, and they just opened it up for us. We just had carte blanche access from people who had just like cold called to really take a look, and it was just fascinating what we were able to see and understand there. And subsequent to that, we invited Per to visit us, and he was here in March, so just recently. And as I mentioned, he was instrumental in that system change in the 90s. So here's somebody who saw a system of punishment and was part of the change getting them to where they are. So if you think about what tools do you need to maybe make some shifts here, having someone with that understanding is really valuable. And what I'll say is, in conversations with him, what he learned was, when he was thinking about what are the best practices, he went to Canada, he went to England. There were things he learned from the US. It wasn't that, hey, this is Norway, we're just going to do our own thing here. It was saying, what are the best practices? I don't know certain things. We don't know certain things. What can we learn? And so he was also here for the launch of the documentary Transforming Corrections in Bridgeport on March 16. And we had a panel discussion after that. And so here's that panel discussion. What I'll say here is we have plans for further screenings across Connecticut in late summer and early fall 2023. If you want to host, reach out. We'd be glad to help put together a panel or screening, provide information for you and the like. Next up, we have a contingency of a smaller group, 5 to 10. We're not bringing cameras this time, but hopefully some local media, because media is important, and how they present on this and their understanding of systems is also important. We're going to be looking at the larger system there. So all of these systems that we've seen so far have a Ministry of Justice. They have essentially a bulwark against the political class in terms of their impact on how the justice system is run. So it's the ministry that talks to the elected officials. It's not a correctional commissioner. It's not, so it's insulated from that, so that these changes don't occur because of an anecdote or because of a heightened idea of a need to do something because of an emotion of a moment. This is braced against by this ministry, which also holds them accountable to standards. So, Connecticut, and this is the US in general, we call it a system, but it's really a set of individualized agencies. There's different branches, and that we hope work together, that do have partnerships in a lot of ways, but they're not held accountable by a ministry or something like that is holding them to certain standards. Tomorrow, we're going to have a salon on human rights in particular, because this is with that consortium I'm talking about. I'm going to be on that. Rudiger, Professor Dr. Wolf, Per will be on that, and Brittany as well. There's the Zoom link. We can send more information. Deliverables. So what are we getting out of this? And so a lot of this is fact finding, as I mentioned, best practices, collaborative, and so hopefully, and we're doing this work to some degree already. We're studying the law, the policy, the economics, the regulations, how the system operates, and looking to draft corresponding policy recommendations here in Connecticut. When Governor Malloy came back, he said he wanted to do everything. Well, in order to do everything, you have to know how everything else is run. And so it's not a one-for-one. Societies are much different, but at least in understanding how they put together there's some ideas for how we can do it here. We're primarily in this phase right now focusing on education, bringing that experience, more experiences like this to people in Connecticut, but also to the general public through the documentary, through other things, working with like a Quinnipiac Inside Out program, with Wesleyan, with Yale, with the CSCU system and others to develop these resources and content. And again, I mentioned the community conversations and engaging the public. Again, the public owns the justice system, and so they should know more about it. They should know what they're investing in. And so this is an idea of showing not just what the justice system here in Connecticut is, but other systems, so they can have a choice in terms of what they think their justice system should look like. So another big thing is the Norwegian Correctional Services. I mentioned there were a lot of people that are getting interest in that, has had their door knocked on so many times with a staff, I think, of only 8 pairs in there. They had to make a decision. You're only getting through this way. We got in through the side door, just so you know. But they told us now we have to go in through the front. Fine, because that means a partnership with Amend. Amend is a public health and human rights program at the University of California, San Francisco, and they have this prison culture change initiative that they're doing, and they're doing it with frontline staff working in CO. So you see their staff from Norway talking to staff from they're in a number of states out west, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, North Dakota, California. And if you saw recently in March, Governor Newsom in California announced the historic transformation of San Quentin. Maybe some of you don't know of San Quentin. I lived out in California. San Quentin is famously where Charles Manson was. It may still be there, actually. But it is notoriously hardened correctional center, and that changing that into the rehabilitation center. They want it to be the best in the nation, and they're using Bree, who is the director of Amend, is the co-chair of that, and it's based on this work that they're doing with Norway. And so there's a lot of potential here. We've only really just scratched the surface. Collaboration and partnership is really key. I have mentioned a lot, but there's a lot I didn't mention in the partnerships that we had. But just put my contact information there for anybody that wants to know more. And at this point, I'll open it up to questions and conversations for, unfortunately, a short period of time. So I'll do that. Anyone?
This may be a stupid question, but all this doesn't mean that everybody's getting out, like everybody rehabilitated and then let loose.
You mean
some people who are gonna stay in for life?
So, well, okay, so it's a good question. What are the length of sentences in Connecticut versus Norway or Germany? Norway, the maximum sentence is 21 years. You can have life without parole here in Connecticut, so you can be confined for life. We got rid of our death row, And so there is the prospect of people not being able to be released here. You heard maybe if you were paying attention, this commutation idea, this practice that happens in Connecticut, it's done in every state. Normally, it's the governor that can commute a sentence. Here, we've delegated that authority to the Board of Pardons and Parole. And so they were looking at these really long sentences, which weren't a part of the justice system in the US prior to the 1970s, by the way. But yes, so they do have the possibility, it's called preventive detention in Norway and Germany, where, for instance, there's a fellow in Norway, Baron Breivik. He went onto an island where there was a youth camp. There was, I think, 70 youth kids that he murdered. Essentially, they were of the progressive political class there, and he got preventive detention. So he had I believe, a 21-year sentence. But every 5 years, he can then come and argue that he's rehabilitated. It's in society's best interest that he be released. Chances are that probably won't happen. But they leave that to the system to make that decision. They don't leave that to the general public. They don't leave that to a particular victim because they've designed systems and they want the best practices to govern what they do.
What happens after 21 years with this person? It's free, or they're?
No, they're in preventive detention until they're released. So they got a 21-year sentence, but after that, so you don't have that opportunity prior to 21 years, but at 21 years, you go in front of a system of court where you can make the argument for release, and then you either get sent back or it's every 5 years.
Oh, so theoretically, they could keep you.
Yes, it's a very small percentage. I think up here about 120 or 130 people are in preventive detention in Norway right now. So in Connecticut, the primary reason for incarceration has changed over the years. Before it was like a lot of burglary, larceny, like those, and then the 70s, a lot of it became actually returned to prison based on a probation or parole violation. Now I heard Mike Lawler mention murder is the number one reason. So we have a lot of people serving a lot of long sentences, and we're dealing with that in terms of, this is another thing that you think about, is Connecticut, the state is also paying for the health and well-being of individuals that are turning 70, 75, 80 years old, that are no longer a threat to society, but are an exorbitant cost to the system. We can't use Medicaid or Medicare federal dollars to be able to, because that's the rule of that. And so we're also paying for this in more ways than one. Yeah, so. Yes.
I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but people in preventative detention, can they also vote?
The right to vote is not taken away from anyone. Yeah, there's not exclusions. And not only that, because of that, they actually have candidate forms within the prisons there. So they see them as citizens. So they want their vote. And so they go in and they inform. And, so I didn't talk about it much, but this normalization concept there is this idea of you're trying to pull people who are already on the margins of society closer to society. You're not trying to push them out. As we found through the work with the Sentencing Commission, and generally people know, most likely 99% of the people going to prison aren't voting prior to getting there. Right, they're probably not registered. If you look in Hartford and Bridgeport and New Haven, the largest drivers of our correctional system, the voting population per the larger population is minute compared to who could actually vote. So the idea here is like, you're not taking away anything. Your actually idea is you're giving them a ticket back into the society that they've been marginalized from. And so, yeah, no, they don't. Yeah. So, and that concept of normalization crosses a number of areas. So the idea of who runs various systems within the Department of Correction in Norway, education is run by the local education system. Healthcare is run by the local healthcare system. the libraries are not prison libraries, they're your local library. So Hartford Public Library would be in Hartford Correctional, and you'd be able to get a book from Hartford Correctional out of any Hartford Public Library and all the variety of books that are available here. It's not something that's localized to that particular library. It means you're a part of that. You have a library card when you go out that can be utilized in a number of places.
There's a question in the chat that says, do we know the data on the male versus female prison population in Norway?
We do. I don't have that on me. Per, do you know?
7% women.
That's in Norway. In the US, I don't know, but I do know that it's a growing population, and that's been one of the areas of concern, is that the youth in particular in Connecticut are being locked up a lot less than they were. We are getting a lot of people serving the longer sentences, but that decarceration that I talked about primarily hit the male population, not necessarily the female population. But there's an area too where I would like to say, in talking with Per, he doesn't feel as though they're doing a justice to the women in the Norwegian prison system, that they really haven't paid as much attention to them as they should. And here's where they could maybe learn from some of the things that we're doing here. And actually the warden of the only female facility we have in Connecticut, Trina Sexton, the York Correctional, went on the trip to Norway and is very interested in bringing back these reforms there too. All right, good. All right. Well, thank you all for participating. Thank you all online. Again, this is the last of the Lunch and Learn. If you have any ideas for any further conversations, please share. We're going to keep the room open for a little bit so we can save the transcript or not. But if you have any ideas in the chat, please send them along. Anybody else? We're on the 4th and 5th floor here at the Hartford Times building, and you're always welcome. Our doors are locked, unfortunately, but you can knock and we'll open.
Thank you.
You're always
everyone.
welcome. The doors are locked.
Yeah. Thank you, Per. Good to see you.
Very nice to see you.
A little better.
Well, thanks the same, Jay.
Let's get together. Nice work, Andrew. Much information.
I think it was just Per. Oh, no, there wasn't a.
Do those online cards. I wonder if.
All right, I'm gonna end. I don't know if you can hear me. Okay.
We can hear you.
Shoot you an email in a little bit, okay?
Bye.
Okay.
All right, take care, Andrew. Nice work.
Yes, well done.